Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this talk by Stefan Schubert. Hope you've all been having a good day so far, not too tired and ready for this great talk. So a short introduction of Stefan. Stefan is a researcher at the Center for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His research focuses on the intersection of moral psychology and philosophy, specifically on psychological questions relevant to effective altruism. He explores topics such as the reasons for the ineffectiveness of altruistic actions and why people don't invest more in safeguarding their common future. Prior to this current position, Schubert has worked at the University of Oxford and the Center for Effective Altruism. So please give a warm round of applause for Stefan Schubert.
Great, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to talk about virtues for effective altruists. Usually when we talk about effective altruism, when we think about effective altruists, we do so in terms of acts or actions, like which charity should I donate to, which career should I choose, what should the next step be in my professional career, and so on. But we can also think about effective altruism in terms of character or virtues, in terms of what kind of person I should be. What virtues should I cultivate? So examples of virtues are, for instance, kindness, truth-seeking, honesty. We will see other examples throughout this talk. So I should emphasize that these two perspectives on effective altruism, they are definitely compatible. So focusing on virtues, that of course not mean, not talking about acts. That's also an important perspective. But in this talk, I'm going to argue that this virtue perspective is important and that we should maybe emphasize that a little bit more. But before I come to arguing for this virtues perspective, I need to define a bit what a virtue is. So virtues are a type of character traits. And character traits, they are sort of a natural tendency to act in a certain way. So one character trait is honesty. So an honest person tends to sort of instinctively answer questions honestly. That's just something that comes naturally to an honest person. Similarly, an aggressive person tends to instinctively react with aggression in a conflict. And virtues are, I would argue, desirable character traits. So kindness is widely seen as a virtue. Because it's seen as desirable, whereas malice is usually not seen as a virtue. So a virtuous person then has desirable instinctive reactions. They react with honesty and kindness and so on in various situations. Okay, so with that clarified, let's go on to why we want to cultivate virtues. So I would say that, if we were perfectly rational do-gooders with perfectly strong willpower, then we might not have needed virtues. We would just have decided what to do, and then we would just have done it. There would be no problem whatsoever. But of course, all humans fall way short of that ideal. So this leads us to the first reason for cultivating virtues. We are weak-willed. We have weak willpower. We instinctively react in ways which we don't endorse under reflection, or we act in ways that we don't endorse under reflection. So, for instance, we fall for temptations. We might have decided to go on a diet, but then we eat more than we had intended to. Or we're impatient. We had decided to defer gratification to later, but then we're just too impatient and we can't do it. So having virtues that improves our instinctive reactions. So for instance, cultivating the virtue of patience that might help us overcome impatience. And then there's a second reason which is very similar but subtly different. That is that we are often poor at estimating the effects of certain unvirtuous behaviors. So consider this question. Should fundraisers misrepresent charity effectiveness to increase donations? noted they shouldn't, but what are the reasons for that? Like, well, we can consider two different perspectives on this question. So one is a sort of like purely act-focused approach, where you just focus on the individual act of misrepresenting charity effectiveness in an individual case. So then what you would do is that you would just calculate the costs and benefits of this act and do what appears best. You would think, well, on the one hand, it sort of seems wrong. If someone would find out, they would have this reputational cost. But on the other hand, it could increase donations to effective charities. So you do it in this way. And this is risky because, you might misestimate and you might underrate the cost. And then, in some cases, the downside could be quite severe. And I think this is also especially a risk in a large community of do-gooders, because suppose, for instance, that someone does this and then people find out, then you will personally take a reputational hit, but it could also affect other people in the community. And people might go like, well, these effective altruists, they are sort of misrepresenting facts for the supposed greater good. So I think this is perhaps especially important to not to do this in a larger community of people. So consider then the alternative approach, which is the virtue-focused approach. It's actually much simpler. It just says, in these kinds of situations, act as the virtue of honesty suggests. And obviously, it says that we should not misrepresent the charity effectiveness. So it's just very simple. So following virtues like honesty, it sort of safeguards against harmful mistakes in these kinds of situations. So there's a subtle difference here, which is that, the first reason is about, virtues improving your instinctive reactions. The second is about deliberately acting as a virtue suggests, in this case, it was the virtue of honesty. But this is a common thread, and that in both cases, the virtues, they help mitigating our humans' shortcomings. So I think that ignoring virtues and focusing on acts alone, it's in many ways naive. It's based on a naive, over-optimistic view of human psychology, that we will just do the right thing if we just focus on this individual act. And we need virtues to sort of counteract our shortcomings. So that was sort of the case for virtues in general. But let's now move to what specific virtues we might want. Historically, of course, many groups have talked about the importance of virtues. So, for instance, the Greeks, Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, they were definitely big on virtue. So they had these 4 virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And then you had the Christians in the Middle Ages. They were big on the Greeks, so they took those, especially because they were fans of Aristotle. But then they also add specific Christian virtues like faith, hope, and charity. So then you had the 7 virtues, which were sort of opposites of the more widely known 7 deadly sins. So in today's society, I don't think people operate with sort of explicit lists of virtues to the same extent. But I would still say that common sense ethics, the kind of ethical system that most people in society sort of implicitly operate with, this system operates with an implicit list of virtues, which include virtues like honesty, integrity, kindness, and so on, fairness. And I would argue that these virtues play an enormous role in social life. So they're sort of supported by powerful norms. If some politician, for instance, doesn't display honesty, or if they behave saliently dishonestly, then they're often penalized. Well, a bit to varying extents, but as a broad statement, I still think that's true. And we sort of rewarded and praised for acting honestly. So there are these powerful norms that sort of prop up these common sense virtues. So then there's the question of whether effective altruists should cultivate these common sense virtues. And yeah, I've basically given away the answer, but I'm just going to go through it a bit more systematically here. Yes, they should. So there are different arguments. Like, so one argument is just that, well, it's intrinsically wrong to behave without honesty in integrity. So many people would subscribe to that argument. But some people, consequentialists, people who believe in the consequentialist ethics, they don't believe that it's sort of intrinsically wrong. They just think that, well, the only thing that ultimately matter are outcomes in the world. But even for them, I would argue that it makes sense to cultivate common sense virtues because it creates better consequences. It will, like we saw, it will improve your instinctive reactions and it will decrease the risk of costly mistakes. And similar arguments apply to other standard virtues like kindness and fairness and so on. So that's sort of like, with regards to common sense virtues, that's my main message, that it makes a lot of sense to follow them. I do want to point out, though, that there is some nuance here. Obviously common sense virtues can be criticized. For instance, there are often clashes between different virtues. So, a friend of yours might have made a mistake. So, the virtue of honesty might dictate that we should criticize them. But then, on the other hand, that might, make them not so happy. So then the virtue of kindness might suggest that we shouldn't. So there's a clash, and how to resolve this depends on lots of finer details. And then, there's some extreme circumstances like, war, or maybe you're fighting a dictator, and there's some information that you have that it's really important that you don't give them. And then, in many such circumstances, it is actually permissible to lie, for instance. So it's not the case that sort of, in my view, that we should never lie, but under normal circumstances, it's a bad idea. So anyway, this just say that there is a lot of nuance, but unless there are strong countervailing reasons, it's a good idea to follow the common sense virtues. So that's the sort of first message with regards to what specific virtues effective altruists should cultivate, in my view. But then there is the second message, which is that there are also virtues that are characteristic of effective altruism that are not emphasized by common sense ethics, at least not to the same extent and not in the same way as they're emphasized by effective altruism. And to find those, we need to think a bit about what is specific about effective altruism. What are some key insights of ours? So one is that, well, it's very important to choose effective ways of helping. It makes a big difference if you choose the most effective way of helping versus a less effective way of helping. And to find them, you need careful thinking and extensive research. So this entails certain actions, choosing the effective charity and researching charities. But these actions don't always come naturally to us. We face, as it were, psychological obstacles, like we already saw. We're not we don't have perfect willpower all the time. So therefore, we need to cultivate corresponding virtues. So one virtue, which I will discuss here, is what I call effectiveness focus. So this is the desire to choose more effective approaches when we're helping others. And another is truth-seeking, sort of a strong desire to find the truth. So those are two virtues. I will also give some other examples, and I'll elaborate on these two. But before we get to that, let's look a bit on methodology. How can we find these virtues that are of special significance for effective altruists? So we can basically use the standard importance, tractability, and neglectedness framework with some slight modifications. So this is a framework that has been used in effective altruists to find top causes like global poverty and existential risk and so on. So we can use that also to find virtues that are important. So the importance criterion is here how much our impact would increase if we acquired the virtue. So for instance, if we acquired the virtue of effectiveness focus, then we would choose more effective interventions and thereby our impact would increase. So like it seems to score well on this criterion. And the second is tractability, how feasible it is to acquire this virtue. And I will argue that in a minute that I think it is fairly feasible to acquire this virtue, at least to some extent. But then the third criterion here, neglectedness, I don't think it really applies in the case of virtue, so we can forget about it. It's simpler in this case, it's just importance and tractability. And using this methodology, I have identified 6 virtues of special significance for effective altruists together with my colleague Lucius Caviola. So these are effectiveness focus, truth-seeking, collaborativeness, determination, moderate altruism, and moral expansiveness. I should also say that this list is sort of like, it's our hypothesis. People might quibble with this, or like there might be others that they want to add, but this is our suggestion. So let's go through them in order. So the first is effectiveness focus then. So like we saw, it's very valuable to choose the most effective actions. So some research suggests that the most effective charities are 100 times more effective than the median charity. But then there are psychological obstacles in our way that sort of prevent us from actually donating to them. So there's just status quo bias. We might be used to donating to certain charities, so we just continue doing that without sort of considering alternatives. There's salience, like there's some charities are just more salient. They report it on in the news, and we might be naturally inclined to focus on them or to donate to them. We have attachment to specific causes. And to overcome these obstacles, we then need to cultivate a focus on effectiveness. And I would argue that like many effective altruists do so reasonably successfully. So in the effective altruist community, I would argue that this virtue is, even if people don't couch it in those terms, like effectively, this virtue is celebrated, and you're sort of rewarded by your peers for behaving in line with this virtue. And I think that by and large works. And this is a theme that we will see again and again, that like, your peers' views and your peers' rewards, that makes a difference. And then truth-seeking, as we saw, it's hard to find the most effective options, the most effective approaches to doing good. And we need to do careful thinking and extensive research to find them. And here also we face psychological obstacles, cognitive biases, motivated reasoning. We might want a certain charity to be the most effective one, so then we might sort of seek evidence that confirms that view and then sort of disregard evidence that disconfirms it. That's a very common human tendency. We might just be unwilling to do all the hard research work that it requires to find the most effective charities. And so to overcome these obstacles, we need truth-seeking, or as the writer Julia Galef put it, a scout mindset, sort of an open-mindedness and a willingness to change our beliefs. And yeah, I would argue that this too is like feasible to improve on. And again, like in the effective altruist community, it seems to me that like people often praise each other for sort of changing their mind, and I think that makes a difference. A third one is then collaborativeness. So we can be much more effective if we work together, and that's one of the reasons why effective altruists have come together and sort of formed a community. I think this is a bit underrated. So like within the effective altruist community, people sort of divide labor. So like, a natural approach a common approach to doing good is that just, you have your day job and then you do a bit of volunteering on the side. But in effective altruists, there's rather sort of specialization. So like some people, they earn to give, and then they donate to charities, and other people work directly for those charities. And this just seems like a more effective way of doing things that's also like widely practiced in the for-profit sphere. There's like massive specialization of labor in the modern economy. And this is like an example of collaboration which leads to greater effectiveness. And I think also there are other examples, like in Effective Altruists has this great culture of sort of giving and receiving advice, which I've not experienced so much outside of Effective Altruists. So like people ask each other for like, career advice, often fairly informally, and people are very happy to give that, which is very useful. And this is another example then of collaboration leading to greater effectiveness. But here also, I think we face psychological obstacles, because like collaborating, that means compromising. It can feel like a nuisance, like having to do what some other person wants, and we can be proud. And to overcome this, we need to cultivate a virtue of collaborativeness. Like I said, I think that the Effective Altruist community is very collaborative, and this is also something that's been sort of nourished very intentionally. There was one EA Global a few years ago where the theme was doing good together. So there was very much the idea that like this is a norm or a virtue that people wanted to push, I think successfully. So the fourth virtue is determination. So another Effective Altruist slogan was, figure out how to do the most good and then do it. So, it's not enough to just do a lot of planning. You actually need, in the final instance, sort of execute on all your planning as well. And here we face a sort of like formidable psychological obstacle, namely that we often don't do what we intend to do, what psychologists call the intention-behavior gap. And to overcome that, we need determination or like executive function. I think this is one of the harder virtues to cultivate. I'll return a bit to that later on, but it seems very important. And I should also say that like, I think many people in general see this as desirable, like also outside of Effective Altruism, but like maybe not as a virtue in the sort of narrow sense, but I think that for Effective Altruists who actually want to sort of like to increase their impact, it is a virtue in the more narrow sense, or like moral sense as well. Right. So far we've mostly talked about virtues that relate to the sort of the effectiveness part of Effective Altruists, the sort of the E part. But there's also the A part, of course, altruist part. Because to have an impact, we need to share some resources like money or our labor, our time with others. And here we can take two different approaches. So one is sort of extreme levels of altruism, where we share almost all of our resources with others. And another is a more moderate level of altruism, which is closer to common sense ethics. And here, again, there are psychological obstacles specifically to extreme altruism, or in particular to extreme altruism. So like, if we share almost all resources with others, then there's a risk of burnout. And it might also not be very easy to attract people to a community that has that level of expectations, because most people just aren't inclined towards such a level of altruism. So, and I think that here the upshot is that actually that these obstacles are too hard to overcome, so we shouldn't really try, instead we should aim for a more moderate, not the extreme level of altruism, because I think this is just such a sort of deeply rooted human tendency that we prioritize ourselves to an extent. We are altruistic to a sort of impressive extent, I actually think, in many ways, but we won't go that far, and there are many historical examples of how that has failed to try to go for that. So this is a bit different, actually. What I'm saying here is a bit different from what I said with regards to the other virtues. There was more like, well, we should try to overcome these obstacles to truth-seeking or effectiveness focus as far as possible. But in this case, I think we should sort of stop short at some point and go well, we go to moderate altruism, but not further. But I can see that people could have other views as well, but that's what I would argue for. Okay, so the last virtue then is moral expansiveness. So effective altruists emphasize moral impartiality, that we should be sort of not prioritize people who are close to us necessarily, but be morally impartial towards beneficiaries who are distant, First in terms of space, like people in distant countries, in terms of time, including like people in the distant future, and people who are biologically distant, or in terms of substrate, including animals or even digital minds. And here again, we face psychological obstacles because we are naturally inclined towards a narrow circle of moral concern. This is Peter Singer's idea. That, like, for evolutionary reasons, we are inclined in this way. So in the ancestral environment, we were rewarded for being altruistic towards, like, our local clan or tribe, but we were not, so that helped with survival and procreation and so on, but we were not rewarded for helping more distant people. It seems to me that, like, this is also an obstacle that we, to a substantial extent, can overcome. So, like, cultivating moral expansiveness or moral imagination. It seems to me that, like, within the Effective Altruists community, we're sort of like encouraging each other to do that. Yeah, but okay, so those were the 6 virtues. Let's now briefly talk about the cultivation of the virtues. So here I have 2 main messages. So one is that I think it helps to make the virtues part of your identity of who you are, like, depending on, like, how much you endorse the virtue, of course, but, like, to the extent that you endorse it, then it makes sense to sort of make it part of who you are. So this is something that I've taken from Julia Galef, who in her book, The Scout Mindset, talks about, like, making the Scout mindset part of your identity so that you really sort of like changing your mind and are open to that. And so, because, like, effectively this means that you want to be virtuous, and sort of wanting to be virtuous, I would argue that makes you more likely to be virtuous. It doesn't guarantee, of course, like, because there's a lot of hypocrisy, but if you don't even want to be virtuous, then it's unlikely that you will actually be virtuous. So I think that helps. The other thing is this, that I repeatedly emphasize, is, like, idea of virtues as norms, that praising by peers makes a big difference. And I would argue that even though we may not be talking about these virtues in those terms, like, these virtues are widely praised in effective altruism, and I think that helps. Then there's more specific practical training of specific virtues in the effective altruist community. So, for instance, Center for Applied Rationality, they've been sort of running workshops focused, I would argue, on truth-seeking and determination. There's effective altruist coaching that's also, like, focused on determination, I would argue, mostly. And that makes sense because, like I said, like, I think that's like a virtue that is maybe particularly hard to acquire. Summing up, we need virtues because of our psychological limitations. They improve our instinctive reactions, and following them deliberately makes costly mistakes less likely. And then the second thing I talked about was, what specific virtues should we try to cultivate? And then the first message here was that we should follow the virtues of common sense ethics, like honesty and integrity. But we should also add new virtues, and I gave 6 examples here: effectiveness, focus, truth-seeking, collaborativeness, determination, moderate altruism, and moral expansiveness. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Stefan. We're going to open up for questions now. So if you go onto the swap card event for this talk, there is a live discussion, and put your questions in there. The questions with more upvotes will be prioritized, so please, if you see a good question, upvote it so I can ask it as soon as possible. Okay, so I've got a question.
Right.
How do you navigate clashes between virtues, for example, kindness versus honesty, when it comes to friendship?
Yeah, like I said, like it is actually really tricky to do this. And I think in some cases there are sort of real trade-offs. But I also think like in a substantial number of cases you can, it's not quite like you can sort of eat the cake and have it, but you know, to an extent you can do that. Like, I mean, you can often, you know, frame things in a way that, like, you know, make it sound less harsh. And it's a bit hard to just discuss in the abstract, but like if we have a specific example, I think it is often possible. But like with regards to that specific case, I also think that, like, you know, honesty, for instance, it is a fairly important norm, and you know, sometimes you have to give people hard truths and like that are uncomfortable. That's unfortunately the case. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a question here. So Anders Sandberg gave a talk earlier today arguing that virtue ethics is useful for guiding individual action, but is limited when guiding community action. Do you think there are virtues the effective altruism community as a collective, as opposed to individuals, should strive for?
Interesting. I did not attend that talk, so I'm not entirely sure of, you know, what Anders was talking about. I mean, my intuitive sense is that, like, you know, if the effective altruist community is sort of engaging in virtuous behavior, it is doing so in virtue of the fact that, you know, each individual effective altruist is also engaging in that virtue. So like, I mean, for instance, like, you know, if the effective altruist movement is collaborative, which I think it is so in virtue of the fact that, like, individual effective altruists are sort of like, well, someone reaches out for advice, they, you know, they're happy to give advice. So if they're, basically this is what's called methodological individualism in the philosophy of the social sciences, that, like, insofar as there is, like, some macro phenomenon on the level of the community, it is that macro phenomenon exists in virtue of the fact that, you know, there are sort of there's corresponding behavior on the micro level of the individuals. So, like, the individuals implement this virtue. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned there are examples of extreme altruism failing. What examples were you referring to?
Okay, yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I guess I feel like, you know, some political movements, like some forms of communism, for instance, seem to have, in my view, have relied on this notion that, like, people were going to be more instinctively altruistic than was actually the case. Probably the same is true of sort of certain religious groups as well, and there are other examples as well.
How would you like to see the community manage trade-offs between epistemic virtues, like taking disagreement and uncertainty seriously, and effectiveness?
Right. I mean, I guess I feel like, in a sense, effectiveness is more foundational in some ways. But in most cases, I don't feel like there's that much of a clash between those two. Like, the more common clash, which actually has been discussed when in effective altruism, that is between, like, you know, kindness and sort of some kind of, you know, honesty / truth-seeking. But, like, with effectiveness and truth-seeking, I don't see the clash in quite the same way, because you know, often you need to be truth-seeking in order to find the most effective approaches, and then you go on to implement them. Yeah, but I mean, in a sense, like I said, like, effectiveness is more foundational in my view than truth-seeking.
Could we think about moderate altruism as a combination of the virtues altruism and self-care?
Yeah, That is a good question. I mean, I guess, I have actually thought, I had this list of 6 virtues, but then I also went on and sort of created much longer list. I think I had one list that was like 70 virtues, and then like self-care was one of them. So basically, like, of course, you can just go and define any sort of desirable behavior. Like if you take any desirable behavior, you can sort of define a virtue on the basis of that. So so self-care could be seen as a virtue, and that is one way of seeing it. It's not the way I've thought about it so far, but it's a nice idea.
Okay, thank you. That was all the questions we had time for today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again, Stefan. Please give another round of applause.
Thank you.